The international community is still reeling from the initial reverberations of what's been a remarkable day and a half in Russia. On Saturday afternoon, the troops of the Wagner mercenary group were heading north towards Moscow, having left their positions in eastern Ukraine and entered Russia. Vladimir Putin put out a statement calling it a mutiny and said those responsible would be punished. Then, in a dramatic turn of events, the leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, did a deal with Putin and turned his forces around. Well, Dr. Aman Cheskin is with the Department of Central and East European Studies at Glasgow University. He's come into the studio to help us give some analysis to what has been a remarkable 24 hours. Good to have you with us, Aman. Two questions, I suppose, that we're going to be trying to answer between now and midday. What does it mean for Putin's grip on power? And crucially, what does it mean for the war in Ukraine? But let's start, first of all, what on earth happened in the last 24 hours? Could you explain that to us?
It's difficult, and I've got 4 degrees in Russian studies, and I'm still scratching my head to a large extent. So, I mean, cynically, we can say a convicted criminal, a gangster who has gone from hot dog seller to this essentially an oligarch, billionaire, owner of this mercenary group, got within 200 kilometers of Moscow. Putin looked scared. Incredible turn of events. And I think we need to understand some of the context here, the political context, and the really complex things, I think, about the Russian system. Because the Russian political system is very hard to understand, but Putin really tried to foolproof the system against coups. Like, he's been really worried about something like this happening for years, because he's seen it in Ukraine, he's seen it in Georgia, places where these hard men kind of were overthrown by popular revolution. So he's ready for it. And so that's why it's so surprising that looked like it was close to really kicking off.
And ended so abruptly.
Right. I mean, that's a really hard thing to understand. For me, what was Prigozhin attempting to do? And that I don't think we have any answers to that. Why would he do this? Because he's apparently brokered a deal through the Belarusian president, Lukashenko, to go to Belarus. But come on, if you're Prigozhin, do you think you can go to Belarus safely now after staging this remarkable, I don't know what we even call it, mutiny of sorts? So
let's drill into that a wee bit. First of all, what is the Wagner Group? Because we're hearing it a lot now, but there are a lot of people listening might know exactly what is the Wagner Group.
Yeah, so it's essentially the most appropriate term, I think, is mercenaries, because they are people often. They started off after 2014, and they were operating in places like Syria, and they were in Africa, in various countries like Mali, etc. And they were doing the dirty work that the Russian army didn't want to be associated with officially. Officially, it's illegal in Russia to have these groups. Prigozhin was very close to Putin and kind of said, "Hey, I'll do it for you." And he was someone Putin really trusted, this is why it's an incredible story.
And tell us about him then.
I mean, Putin really, really loves loyal people. And he surrounds himself with people he can trust, usually from his St. Petersburg days, when he was involved in all sorts of shady deals. Essentially a gangster, really, really corrupt. And so Prigozhin really fits that bill of somebody he'd met, and kind of trusted, ended up giving him these contracts for catering. This is the way the Russian system works. They call it a patron system, because the closer you get to Putin, the more rewards you get. And so you're kind of like beholden to him. And so he has these groups of people. Each of them has their own sort of power, kind of in a certain respect, but he makes sure it's balanced out. So there are people with troops, right? There are interior forces. There's people with the police force, army. That kind of sounds a bit scary, but you would never, ever go against Putin because he looks so strong, and all the other people would come against you because they all rely on him for their huge wealth.
We're going to cross to Kyiv just very shortly, but just before we do, Aman, when did this bromance break down? Very
recently, because a few months ago, Wagner was doing the heavy lifting of Russia's invasion, taking Bakhmut. Many of their recruits were killed. Some of them are kind of battle-hardened soldiers and ex-soldiers from the Russian military. Some were just convicts that they just fed into this horrible meat grinder and died in their hundreds.
Gosh, right. Lots to digest there. But let's cross to the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv now, as we're saying. Freelance journalist Ewan MacDonald is there. Good morning to you, Ewan. Thank you for being with us.
Good morning.
What are you hearing from the Ukrainian authorities? We're trying to piece it all together, aren't we? Like a big, huge jigsaw.
The Ukrainian authorities initially responded by saying this was basically a sign of the breakdown of authority in Russia and the collapse of the Russian Federation, which I think, would definitely like to see, because it would probably mean the end of the war in Ukraine. I think it's more likely to be a symptom of the long-running feud that has been going on between Yevgeny Prigozhin and the defense minister of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, who recently attempted to get the Wagner mercenary company to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense, which would have put it basically under the defense ministry's control. So there's speculation in Ukraine and around the world that this was the main problem between Prigozhin, and it was basically against Shoigu. Although he was acting against Putin, his main target appeared to be Shoigu and Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff of Russia.
And Dr. Ammon Cheskin's still with us. What's been the Wagner's involvement in Ukraine so far?
Well, yeah, they were absolutely instrumental in Russia's war efforts, especially, as I said, taking Bakhmut. And many commentators have noted, right, that the Russians, after the Ukrainians' initial counteroffensive, which was very successful, Russia's only real success offensively was in Bakhmut with the Wagner troops. They had very little success in other parts of Ukraine. So they've played an absolutely instrumental role. However, it was only a few weeks ago that it was announced that the Wagner troops would have to be kind of reintegrated with the Russian armed forces. So that was potentially significant, because then I think Prigozhin might have thought, okay, this is kind of the writings maybe on the wall for my power base, at least militarily. So many people think that was a trigger for some of the things that happened yesterday.
And Ewan, what's the feeling about how this could, if at all, change the outlook of the war and even end it? What's the thoughts there?
Well, initially, this, of course, only lasted a day, but I think Ukrainians were hoping that they would see a drawdown or withdrawal of troops from the front lines in the war. We did actually see that. Chechen units withdrew from Mariinka in Donetsk Oblast. And the Ukrainians started to push forward again on several parts of the front, anticipating a weakening of the Russian deployment in Ukraine. Also, there were hopes that if Rostov-on-Don was where the war is basically managed, was under the control of Wagner and out of the effective control of the Russian Defense Ministry, this might cause disruption to the command and control and the logistics of the war into Ukraine. So Ukrainians were hoping, I'm sure, that this disruption and chaos in Russia would go on for an extended period and allow them to take advantage of that.
And Ammon, the million-dollar question is, I suppose, what happens now?
Oh, yeah, wow, that is a million-dollar question. I think it's very unpredictable. I cannot predict what will happen. I don't think anyone can. Sometimes there'll be triggers now, because the Russian authorities, Putin does look much weaker than he did 2 days ago, undoubtedly. And that's for you and for me and for every Russian citizen, I think. To me, that's clear. So there could be events, maybe it could be in Belarus, right? People might start protesting as they did in 2018. Those protests were really, really significant and were kind of quashed because the Russians stepped in to help Lukashenko. Well, what would happen today if those protests happened again? There are videos today of Russians kind of talking to the Wagner troops in Rostov saying, why didn't you go through with this? So there was some support. So there could be some protests, all sorts of weird and strange protests happening in Russia that might be triggers. There might be new power kind of struggles as people start to worry about their future. Because if you're one of Putin's men, and it is almost exclusively men, of course, who get all their money and their security, and you might start to worry now. And if that's the case, you think in a few months' time, I might be in prison or killed. So you might start scheming to get together with other people. And then this is when it starts to get interesting and sort of a little bit Byzantium, really. And we've seen it before in Soviet and Russian history previously. But very unpredictable.
Ewan MacDonald in Kyiv, what's your analysis of how the fallout from this? And I guess it's so difficult because it's difficult to verify a lot of the information that's coming out of Russia, isn't it? But what's your thoughts?
Yes, I think what will be most interesting will be to see what the fate of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu is. Because he was obviously one of the people who were instrumental in causing all these problems. Prigozhin, I'm sure, accepted his deal because he was told that some sort of action would be taken against the defense ministry. If nothing is taken, of course, he will have been betrayed. He will be in a very bad position in exile in Belarus, and of course, very unsafe. For my part, I don't think Shoigu will be abandoned because he is incompetent yet loyal, and that is, of course, what Vladimir Putin prizes above all is loyalty.
And Amin, just a final question. I was interested in an article from Angus Roxburgh, who's a broadcasting journalist and did PR for a while for the Kremlin. He was talking about the spill out into the rest of Europe. What do you think the consequences could be further afield?
Well, the consequences are mostly for Ukraine, right? Ukrainians, of course, as Ewan said, would welcome the breakup of some sort of chaos in the Russian Federation. I think it's hard to know whether that would be good or bad, but in the short and medium term, anything that weakens the Russian state has to be good for Ukraine, has to be good for European security, if the Russians simply cannot continue to fight this horrible war. So that's the biggest hope. Prigozhin was a horrible man, actually more disgusting than Putin, believe it or not. And I'm sure would have, if in some strange scenario where he did get power, which was hard to imagine, I can't imagine the future of Russia under someone like Prigozhin. So it definitely can be worse. What's next for Russia, but for Ukraine, it has to be good. Any sort of discontent has to be a good thing.
It's fascinating. Ewan MacDonald in Kyiv, thank you so much. And Amin is going to stay with us. We'll get back to Amin just after 11:30 because there is so much to talk about, isn't there?